Excerpted interviews with 6 outstanding Mexican architects filmed in fall of 1980 at the Southern California Institute of Architecture, SCI-Arc, as part of a public lecture series presented under a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. Enrique del Moral.
Yes, first I worked with Obregón Santa Celia, who was a very, very well-known architect in those days, and also with Villagrán, but less with Villagrán than with Obregón Santa Celia. But after a few years, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years, something like that, I started to work by myself.
So you studied with Villagrán in school?
Well, I have studied, and we asked for Villagrán to give the first, the first class in when I was a student. So I became the first disciple of him.
And then when you graduated, you were able to travel?
Well, I told you that
yes.
I was able to travel because I won a lottery.
That's wonderful.
So in the moment I won the lottery, and in those moments where the dollar and the peso really, really, really has a value, it was very important.
And so you were able to travel to Europe?
Yes.
Through Europe?
During 1 year, yes.
And then when you came back, you started practicing?
Exactly, exactly.
How was the acceptance of modern design in the 1930s in Mexico?
It was not accepted.
No.
That's what is difficult of ourselves.
Yes. Because
we have to do a real fight to impose the new ideas, but really a fight that if you can convince how you call them? Not the people, but the people who you travel with.
The leaders?
No, the people.
The clients?
With the clients. You lose the job.
Yes.
Or you do what they want.
Yeah.
And we were young and we don't want to do what they want. So we lose a lot of jobs. And it was difficult to us to convince the people of do what we thought it was good architecture. Maybe it was not, but what we thought it was the real good architecture.
Where did the ideas come from to begin introducing modern design?
Well, in the moment we arrive at the ideas of what we call the functionalism. And the functionalism in Mexico was a very important and a very strong how you call doctrine of philosophy.
Yes, yes.
A very strong one. And even in Mexico it rose to most radical positions, the most radical position in account of the tradition of the functionalism. I think maybe, I think really theoretical. I don't think there were many countries who were so radical in the functionalism like Mexico. The most important influence, I think it was, direct from Le Corbusier of the thinking thoughts of Le Corbusier. I have told you, even more than his own works. More important the thoughts of Le Corbusier than his own works. But nowadays I understand in those moments I didn't realize that what was behind Le Corbusier was the thinking of Gropius.
Yeah?
Yes, of course. The real important man of thinking in those days was Gropius. What has happened that I think now that Le Corbusier has a real power and a real importance of express himself, and he was real a man of our time in the way that he was a man of publicity.
Oh, we would say he's a good PR, public relations man.
Extraordinary, extraordinary. That was not the kind of Gropius. Gropius was much more a scholar. Yes. Much more. And a thinking, he has a thought, very German thought, very disciplined thought.
Yes, yes.
But I think that the man who is behind all that moment is Gropius.
How many years have you been practicing? Since 1930?
50 years.
That's marvelous, and you're still actively practicing. If you had to choose just a few projects, which ones would be the ones that you're the most proud of?
I have told you that the one I work with more pleasure is the housing, because housing expresses the more closely how man is. House and men are absolutely identified. Absolutely. So that's why I am very fond of the design of the house, because really you are dealing with what is the man and what and how differentiated or not is this man, what he thinks, what he feels, what he wants, what he needs, how we live. No, non-programmer you can find more related to man than the house.
Augusto Álvarez.
As always, I'm interested in the beginning years. You were graduated from the National University before it moved.
Yes.
So it's the old school.
I was in the school of the traditional school from the end of the 19th century, and it has a very good image all over the university because it was certain special things and that make it additional aspect of the architect in Mexico.
Were you a student of Jose Villagran?
Yes, I was. When I entered the school, Jose Villagran was the dean of the school. He was very famous for these years because he was undoubtedly he was the beginner of the new movement of architecture in our country.
So he influenced the young people.
Yes,
School.
and when Villagran was dean, the entire schedule of studies was changed, was modernized, and I suppose it makes a point of departure for the new schools developed after this. As you know, the School of Architecture in those years was a copy of the School of Beaux Arts.
As all our schools
Paris,
were as well.
And we start as students of Beaux Arts, making the same kind of work, making large drawings, large copies of
The classical subjects.
the classic subjects, and also the classic buildings of the Renaissance, Gothic era. But it was very interesting, as I suppose that this kind of thing, this transition, was very good for us.
So that was the period, the 40s, when modern design became more acceptable
Yes.
in Mexico.
Yes, by the years of just 2 years before the war, and the years after the war, the 2 or 3 years after the war, it was a very short period. The change was so sudden that we get astonished. We start to make things in a way that we never think it was possible.
How did that affect your practice?
Well, it was very important for our practice. There's one thing that sometimes the architect forget. Well, architectural work is to be lived. Well, I have a philosophy that if you get every day just a little step ahead, you are making something. Then maybe in a lifetime you can't achieve this, but you are trying to do it. It's better than to forget that we are human beings that live in an architecture that we create. That's the worst thing. We are not machines. We have, how do you say, some aspirations and defects and bad habits or many things, but you must take care of them. If you don't care about this, you aren't making architecture. Architecture is a service task. Architecture is a service task, not any other thing.
Agustín Hernández.
I don't believe in colors because I think to paint is for a painter. it's a, how you call, manual crafts.
Yes.
Is for a painter, and the color in architecture has to give the material. The material has their own color. And we have to respect that color. If we want to change color, we can use glasses with color, marbles with color. And
So
you can see
the natural materials with the natural color.
The reflection of the carpet and the wall. You have color. The reflection of the soot and the wall change.
Yes.
I think form is so rich. When you have form, you don't need color. You need color, but there's a plain wall. You need color because you're afraid of empty spaces. Your horror is vacui. Say in Latin, afraid of empty. I think architecture has to be sculpture. I don't believe in sculpture. I think sculpture has to be functional. Sculpture is a car. Sculpture is an airplane, a rocket. I think it's to have sculptures, to make a sculpture is a waste of time. It's only commerce. It's only merchandise. I think architecture could be always a sculpture, a living sculpture.
Sculpture that people live in.
That's the only way to integrate the arts and to make sculpture architecture, and not to put the sculpture inside the architecture. And so really, I feel more the geometric forms for a kind of planning, big plannings, master plannings. No? And for homes, I think circles are more warmy, like more cozy. I love both. I have a contradiction, my feelings, or not. Maybe it's not a contradiction. It's a duality of what I tell you about. The pre-Hispanic, I feel I have half or more, 80% India and 20% Spanish in architecture, in our architecture. Pre-Hispanic is the space of cosmic space. It was the religion of the sky. And with the conquest, we have the religion in the room, in the dark room.
Oh, that's very poetic.
So I believe more in the pre-Hispanic because it's the planning for the future. To have the eyes looking at the stars. The house is for me very interesting because you find the world in the house, no? And the identification with the client is very important. The client and then the society, no?
Yeah. Looking back now over all the different kinds of projects that you've done, which was the most satisfying?
I think it's very relative, no? Quantitative, the military school was so big, it was a big challenge to have the control of that big project, and for the quantitative, I think one of my office.
When was your office built?
About 4 years ago. Because my office has the sense of the military school, not in the big spaces, but about the sense of pre-Hispanic forms, and it has partitions, it's alright that word, but different way of construction. No foundation at all, wires suspended.
So it's a unique structure.
Yes.
A structure. So it is a very interesting, fascinating building.
Abraham Zabludovsky and Teodoro González de León.
Your collaboration has developed through the years, that you do projects independently, then you come together on important projects that you want to share. Would you like to describe that?
And it's not we don't make all the works together. We make only that we want to compartir, what is then to share. Yeah. Or the works who came from the same client, we share automatically. But we are not obligated to.
I think it's a very interesting arrangement. We don't, we have not heard about that here.
Yes, many people are very strange about this arrangement, but we think that it's worked. It's worked, no? Because we think that when you have a complete partnership in all the things in the office and in the secretary, in the wasted, you will have some frictions. It's logical. Frictions, so it's logical. You can, with your best friend, you will have, because if the telephone is busy, you want to speak and some details like this. But if everybody has his own secretary, his own telephone, his own office, you don't have any reason to have any problems. No, that is one way. And the other way is that you don't have any obligation to share
certain things you want to develop alone because your client is very close to you, or you want to develop in very creative thing, very personal, creative motive.
Right. So by keeping your office separate,
yes,
by having some independent projects, by collaborating when you choose to,
when we choose
you keep that collaboration fresh and interesting and enjoyable. That's a very, very interesting concept.
And also it gives us chance to have always young people or new people that bring new ideas and you discuss with them ideas, and it's in a personal, in a small point of view, not in a like a big institution or like the big firms. No, always in a small scale. You can see that we use a material that we experiment in Mexico, that give this substitution of the regular stone with marble, give us the opportunity to make a concrete that is very rich in texture and is very rich in his view. In Mexican point of view also, that you must to build many thousands of square meters in very few months and very often night and day. You cannot put a condition to have a first quality of concrete. It's not possible. And when you hammer this concrete, you have the opportunity to stop many bad things that it was made by the contractor. That's important. That's a very concrete and a very seriously thing, because you cannot ask the contract to make a good work if he must to finish in 8 or 9 months. That is very a big problem. And with with this thing, all these systems, I will tell you, if you can see the Museum Tamayo finishing, I am sure that you will never think the terrible mistakes that the contractor doing the work. It's not possible to. But all these things goes out when you hammer, and all the marble, when it goes broken, has some light that is not the sad that the regular concrete has. This is, I think, it was a hard work, but it's successful. I think that the color is very important, but I think that the color must be in the material, not in putting outside that you cannot control to the weather and to the maintenance. That is impossible. We are very, very careful to use in project things that you must have a big administration or much money to conserve nature. We are very upset about this. Well, we don't mind to put colors inside where you do not have any problem.
Well, I think the best relation with the past is unconscious. Because if you look conscious of the past, you make a pastiche. You make you see in these times we see many of these efforts. I don't think they are very successful. I think the best way to relate to the past is in a subconscious way, not to be conscious of that. We can learn from the past. For example, the open corridor in the convents in Mexico City, in the climate of Mexico City, is very good because it stands very good. We make complicated things, put corridors closed. We can use the open corridor more cheap and natural and works very well. That's learning from the past. Well, I think North America has a good tradition, a very good tradition of a very good architecture in 16th century, 17th, 18th, and 19th century has a good tradition. The tradition of California is very good from the 20s, and it's a good past to look. We can learn many things from these architects of the 20s. And we can learn many things of the architects of the 19th in the East Coast and North America. Very, very good architects. But we can learn direct things, not to try to repeat all the. I think the subconscious influence is very good, but not the way they do now. Many people direct. I don't like that.
Rufino Tamayo has a sentence about his art that I think is worth to apply to our work. He says that the art is universal and only an accent is local. And I think that is also work for us.
It's not bad.
Yes.
Ricardo Legorreta.
One thing I never did is to go out of Mexico to study, and it's not because I didn't want to. I received the right advice from Walter Gropius. He was in Mexico, and I had the opportunity of asking him, and the answer was very beautiful, and I followed it up all the way. He said to me, "Where do you plan to live and work?" I said, "In Mexico." So he said, "Well, then stay there and travel as much as you can." He said, that's what I did. So I never studied outside of Mexico. Right.
How do you look back on those years with Villagran in the office as part of your formative experience?
Without any doubt, extremely definite. Various reasons. First, I think it's one of the few persons I have met that really have a sense of professionalism, of being honest, of the ethics of the profession. And the other thing, which maybe in the States is not so clear and so important, which is the discipline and the sense of responsibility with your own work. In country like Mexico, you can play a little bit with romanticism, and under the flag of romanticism, you can become irresponsible, which is not the same thing. And Villagrán teach us, to everybody who worked with him, that sense of responsibility, of professionalism, and of ethics. And now I find out that for me has been extremely valuable, especially right now when all this chaos of what is an architect is happening. I always remember his very straight and very clear position on it. So it, for me, was definitive on that. More on that field than on the, what we could say, the creative part. That I really started when I left his office to create my own things.
What were other influences that shaped you in those early years?
Very strong influences. I think those are the I'd say direct influences. The other very strong influence we could say is that through my father, through my family, through my life, I have always was teach to my interest in Mexico. The strongest directly to my work has been, of course, through the Chucho Reyes, the painter. Is not very well known, but I think is one of the persons that really felt Mexico more deeply, in the sense of not only he's very well known because of the use of color, but he went much farther than that. I think is the use of color, the sense of humor that he had, the way he was always teasing people about how easy it was to make art and how you can really create environments. I always remember, for example, how he used to tease Luis Barragán, and he used to tell him, look, it's very easy to do your environments. Come tomorrow and you will see this room as the way you will do it. And he used to do that, and he created an environment exactly the same as it went from Barragán.
Yeah.
So Chucho Reyes, of course, Barragán has been an influence. Barragán more than an influence on the architecture itself. I think on the way he as a person, more than as an architect, has been an influence for me. He's a person who has an extraordinary sensibility. And then the thing directly that has influenced me more than even Chucho and Barragán has been the vernacular architecture, which is part of the thing I would like to talk today. For me, it's the most a strong influence, and it still is.
Do you feel that you were influenced by Barragán in the use of color and texture?
Well, I think I could answer that a little more of saying that we are both influenced by Mexico. I think that if you don't think in color, you're not Mexican. I always say that the black and white movies and black and white television shouldn't exist in Mexico. For us, color is part of our life. As I was saying, I cannot think of a wall, I cannot think of a floor or of a building without thinking the color at the same time. I can tell you one story about that. Is I was shocked when we were working for this project here in Los Angeles for Bunker Hill, that the color study was separated from architecture. For me, it was completely incredible. I cannot think that way. So,
because you're used to working in an integrated way.
Yes, so I can tell you that the influence comes from all the environment of Mexico. Any place you go, you see color. So it's the influence, of course, there's a certain influence on Barragán. He has worked very sophisticated way with the color. But basically, the color comes from Mexico more than other things. That's why he was talking about
for him too.
For him and for everybody.
Yeah. Well, that's something you have that we don't have. Is that cultural background?
Yes,
that's so available and so direct. But I have said about you that what Barragán began in the small studies, in the gardens, in the walls, you are now able to continue that exploration in the larger projects, which I find fascinating.
Well, yes, the idea is that I am trying to experiment and to use those things in the everyday life, and not only in one small space which is very special for certain things. I think that it's completely different to do a place for one person or a group of person that try to really work with a space which is practically public, such as a hotel or an office building. Because it's not only the point of view of getting involved in all the technical problems of architecture, is that you're doing something for everybody, which is it's a little more difficult. And I always complain and I always regret that he didn't get involved in that kind of work. He's too selective for my point of view.
Well, when we were with him, he spoke of the office building in Monterrey. Would that be a larger project?
Yes,
for him?
I think it's the first one he's
That's
getting
what
involved
I was thinking.
So
the first
I'm very interested to see what comes out of it.
That is going ahead.
It seems so. That's what he told me. That is going ahead.
In terms of the various building types, and you have touched many, what do you find the most satisfying?
All of them. I think it's one of the.
That's great.
I think it's one of the great things you can have as a Mexican, as an architect in Mexico, is that you are able to work in various type of buildings continuously, and that gives you all kind of points. So I always try to have all that variety. I can tell you that, for example, I'm always doing a house, always, only one. But I'm always doing a house.
You find that satisfying in a special way.
And then people sometimes they say that, for example, to do a factory is rather boring. I find it very exciting. So I don't see any difference. I can tell you that the most important thing for me is the type of people you're going to build, which they are always interesting people. The users of the buildings, they are always interested. What can spoil the building is either the owner or the architect. So what I'm worried about is what kind of owner I'm going to work with. And that I'm very careful that we have the kind of communication to really work with. If that communication exists, I enjoy any kind of building experience. One building I haven't done, which I would like very much to do, is a church. I haven't done anything about that, and I would like very much to do something really very connected with the spiritual feelings. Church, a monastery, something like that.
Well, I hope that opportunity is forthcoming.
We'll see if it happens.
Yeah. Well, I think that looking over your work, the characteristics that seem to emerge are the things that you've talked about: the use of color, the use of texture, the relationship to your cultural heritage, that makes you particularly a Mexican architect. Yes. And yet you have, your work, I think, has a universal appeal. And that's what makes it so interesting to us.
I will add one thing to what you have mentioned. I don't know if I have achieved or not, but it's one of the main goals is to try to design, but very, very honestly, I think that we architects are very demagogic on our position. Here I'm talking truly about it, to be able and try to design for the human being and not for the rest of the architects. I think right now architects, we design either for the rest of the architects or for the photographers. And we always forget about designing for the people who are going to build the building and the users. So that's one thing I would like. If I were able to make people happy when they are in my buildings, then I'm very glad about it. That would be the happiest thing that can happen to me. That people who use the building are happy, that will be the best.
immediate results. And Franklin himself applied it, and he did it at all times. I think that Franklin's view of overlapping interest was one thing that we practiced. Except Franklin, when he was working with an adversary, was always appealed to the strengths of the adversary and worked from the adversary's strengths. I was in the waiting for Sarge Shriver while he was ambassador to Paris in sort of his waiting room, and I picked off the shelf some letters of Franklin and began to read them. And it happened to be the letters where he was negotiating. Now, Shriver at the time was trying to decide how they could seat all the Vietnamese at the table, and during these peace, when they could never get the arrangements set, and they were not coming to any agreement. And as I read this correspondence, it was really marvelous, because Franklin would pick out a point with his adversary, a point with which he had held great agreement. And he would develop this thing and develop it logically. And he would say, now if this what you say, and which I believe to hold true, if you would apply it in this way, then if you would apply it in that way, how would you feel that these relationships could be brought about, etc. And he would sort of, through his adversary's own statements and own logic, lead them to a kind of a solution in which no one was embarrassed and the thing was good. And I gave it to Sarge Shriver. I said, if you take this to bed with you tonight, if you read it, you can have some solutions to the settings at this table. Now, you get the feeling, by and large, that these are what you would call educated people. It's in a way that would really make a difference to what happened, in a sense, around them. They took their pleasures seriously. They're not afraid of trial and error. They seem to behave really as if they owned the place in many, many ways, which we miss today. And they're quick to hand on newfound knowledge to others. Franklin was always doing it. But there was not much teaching available at that time. There was very little formal teaching, but there was one hell of a lot of learning. And these fellows had a tremendous pressure. There was a pressure of immediacy to learning and to enrich their lives and their work by learning. And there's a great thing about this kind of found education. In many respects, we have lost some of the richness that can come from it. And that is, there are a lot of false starts in the learning process while you try to learn. There are things that you get into and you have to back off. There are little cul-de-sacs in which for the moment you're absorbed, you're loving it, you're enriching your life, and you get the clue to another direction. But these things are never lost. They're always left there as monuments. They're sort of guideposts as a way. And when problems come along, and problems of a nature that you've never encountered before, it is those great loves that you have developed in terms of this learning process that invariably sort of either come to your rescue or in some respects guide the way. And there's much to be said about this kind of a found education. And I think there's much to be said in our particular time. And this, in a sense, is the celebration of the Franklin Jefferson era. That is, to relive, to reinstate some of these continuities between one discipline and the other. The very educational system itself has seemed to break, to compartmentalize, to cause discontinuities. There are many things that happen. I know, recently we as tradesmen, we call upon sort of the whole tradition of architectures to sort of feed us in our work, and we're looking and we're concerned about the education and what can happen to educate the young and the architect. And what happens very often when a young architect comes into the office, one of the problems is, it's not only that he can't draw, that's sort of bad enough, or that he doesn't sort of walk straight or some things. It's in many respects, they're not quite educated. And they're what is it? What we really would like to have, you'd like to see, is some readiness to see a situation as an example of a general case, sort of a classic case. You want to have a young guy who is comfortable with parables, with metaphors and puns, and that he's not too quick to explain immediately why it wasn't a fair test. Because in life, there aren't any real fair tests. There may be in school, but in life there really aren't, and you don't want to hear it. You want them to be able to act as though they own the place. Absolutely. Do it. When we were talking about a course or some modules that we were thinking of what we would love to have young architects know before they got into it, or while they got into it, or before they got out to it. We were trying to devise a course. And what kind of things would you do? And we had a list of things. For example, we'd have a bunch of little film modules, and we would have them have a film on, let's say, the art of estimation. Sort of the delights, the love, the excitement of how you estimate things, sizes, lengths, times, what will fit into what. Something about the lore of large numbers. Something about, you say, visual language, like map projections, projections in general, perspective triangulation, something about celestial navigation. You'd like to have them know about the uncles of our time, the people to whom you go for help and when the problems are tough. And that is people like something on Francis Galton, about Charles Babbage, about Darwin, something about their lives, something about Isambard Kingdom Brunel and what he went through in the building of the Great Eastern, because that's the story, that's really the story of creativity, if you want to hear it. We want to have him there's so much said in the museums and things about the painters and the artists that did the work. We want him to know something of the role of the user, that is the demandingness of the user that sort of made these great things come about. It didn't all come out just through as the work of the artists. We want him to know something about the gods and something of how they got that way. We want them to know something about Daumier and Lavoisier. We want them to know, above all, about Brunelleschi, and really what Brunelleschi meant. Because in school I had a great history teacher that sort of passed it on to me, and by God, you felt, if Brunelleschi had been the hero of the Renaissance, things wouldn't have quite come out the way they did. Something happened too quick and too soon. Something about protein molecules as entropy reversers, and entropy reversers in general, man as an entropy reverser. We want them to know about natural selection, the process, symbiosis, exotic animals. The difference between the discussion between wave and particle theory. These are things you'd like to have. These and many other things, Vasari's lives backwards and forwards. These are the things you'd like an architect to come, and these are the things that, in a sense, these men had. There was, oh God, I'm lost. At any rate, I had a good tagline here someplace, and I can't find it. Ray, come up, and before you go into the exhibition. I had a tagline. I forgot what we're going to talk about.
I really just want to say, for myself, I know for Charles how touched we are with the honor this evening, and you can believe how much it means to us all. And I hope you will see the show. Now, if you can find your line.
I can't find my line, but thank you very much for what has happened here tonight. I haven't got the time.
Conrad Waxman, we don't have honorary associates very often, but I hope that the next time the next president can call upon you to make the introduction. Charles and Ray, again, there's nothing more that we can say than thank you, and we're all much richer for having you here this evening. And thank you. We'll now adjourn to the exhibit across the court, and thank you for coming.
This program is made possible by grants from International Business Machines Corporation and the National Science Foundation.
now just about 25 years ago.
I don't think it's changed. People who come and visit it have noticed it's changing, things growing more, but I think we just settle in and not look at it. We've lived in the house since 1948. I think we moved in on Christmas Day.
We had originally, in a way, planned to build a house in Santa Monica, right in the heart of the city, more or less a walled-in situation, because we liked the idea of taking a very anonymous kind of spot right in the city, building a high wall around it, and create, almost like in the Spanish tradition, a house where you opened a small door and it expanded out and up to the sky. And so what happened, that plan was immediately shot down because we discovered what was a marvelous site here. I mean, how many places this close to the city where you have like 4 acres? We hawked everything we had in order to make the down payments on the land because it was a remarkable thing.
Spent all our spare time here. Began to think it would be a criminal to put that house in the middle of the field.
The meadow became the thing to maintain, because normally the meadow is the site. We've seen so many pieces of architecture which started as a beautiful site, and you put the building on it, there's no longer a site. So we left the meadow as it is, carved a slot in the side of the hill, and put the house behind this set of eucalyptus trees.
I think I went out to Los Angeles around 1948, maybe 1950, really to see the house that Charles had designed for himself and for Ray. And that's when I first met them. Right after World War II, I think an awful lot of people in this country and around the world were talking about using industrial materials, standard industrial materials, to create a new kind of architecture, prefabricated buildings, prefabricated houses. And what Charles was trying to do there was to take perfectly standard parts out of building materials catalogs and create a completely new kind of environment. And it was done in an absolutely flawless way. No one had done it before. And yet, in this first effort, a really radical departure for home building, if you like, he did such a perfectionist job that it hasn't been equaled since. It continues to be really one of the most significant houses built in this century.
I think he's always been, certainly since I've known him, he's always been interested in technology. Their house on the cliffs above the sea is a house made largely of standard steel prefabricated parts, bought from a steel supplier. Sheet, girdered trusses, those triangle openings, and they're put together in a way that doesn't look at all like a factory shed, but the same materials are in it.
While it is a steel house, it has very much in common with a kind of house that you would have built out of raw timber or logs or something, because of the elements all show. It actually did work very well as a system. Interesting thing was that the house that we designed of these materials was entirely a different house. It was a bridge house that sort of went out between these trees that you see here and didn't touch the ground except at 4 points. But when we did that, and the material, we finally got a building permit, which was very difficult to obtain and all the material was laying on the site. We said, well, we've done the most minimum house with the most steel that you can do. Let's try to reverse the process. Take the material that we have on the site, redesign the building so it uses exactly the same amount of material as there, except attempt to expand it into the greatest kind of volume with the least material. The fact is that we had to fabricate one bar joist in order to do it. It's like a game building something out of found objects, which is the nicest kind of exercise you can do. I was trained as an architect, but then architecture, particularly at that time, was a great base for many kinds of things. We haven't left architecture because architecture, you know, exists in, whether it's in film or in the exhibitions or concepts, ideas of any sort. I think it's architecture. That's what we draw on all the time.
Ray, what was your background?
I had been trained as a painter and worked with Hans Hofmann for many years. But again, when we were working on the furniture and on the house and again in film, it never seemed like leaving painting in any way because it was just another form.
But never consider going from architecture to furniture, for example, as a break in continuity, because a piece of furniture is just architecture at a smaller scale. And even as far as Ray is concerned, the piece of furniture is just like painting, an organization of the structure of a painting in 3 dimensions. It's the same process.
Nobody had got into mass production with good modern furniture in this country. So I suggested a competition. We were all young architects, one part or another in the country here. We were all very excited about modern furniture. Architects always are interested in furniture. And we had certain examples that we knew about that were already sort of classics. The Mies furniture and some Breuer furniture, particularly his first chair, and the Alto stuff, which was single plane bent plywood, and we loved it. It was marvelous, just excellent furniture. And everybody was racking his and her brain to think, what next can happen, you know? And so one absolute major thing was this business of deciding that you could make plywood in 3-dimensional shapes. Okay, that was sort of the technical point. The design point, the artistic point, I will say, is what they did with that idea. And that's what shows here. You know, the sudden complete blending of a brand new idea with an enormous design sensitivity and creative drive that produced a whole new way of making furniture, thinking about furniture, and it's been the most important thing of the century in furniture. There's no question about it. Well, the thing that about comfort in chairs was that anybody could make a pretty comfortable chair by just padding the dickens out of it. A big padded chair was a pretty comfortable thing, the overstuffed thing. This furniture, as opposed to the overstuffed, the very padded thing, was able, through this molded plywood technique, to come at it through developing a basically comfortable and, let's say, supporting form.
The general misconception about the shape, because when people say shape, and immediately afterwards there was a rash of sitting in a soft material and make a casting of your behind as a work. And that isn't true, because it is a non-architectural solution to the problem, because what the solution really depended on, you've got a certain amount of bulk in your physiology, but there are also a lot of certain points that take stresses. What it really depended was a recognition of this in the molding of the plywood, so it was really support. It was a form that would support, not a form that would completely conform.
Wasn't it you that called attention to the love affair between architects and chairs?
I think that's been a running one.
Practically every one of the major steps of furniture design, especially chairs perhaps, in this century has been by an architect.
One of the aspects of modern architecture that became terribly important in the 20s and 30s, I think, was the sort of articulation of different elements, articulation of structure. So that, for example, in a modern building, you would be able to tell exactly what was holding up what, and what was serving what kind of space. There would be a stair tower, let's say, that would be separate from the rest of the building. There would be structural columns and beams expressed in the facade and so forth. And when you look at the early Eames chairs especially, you'll find that in them again, the different elements are quite clearly articulated. There's a steel, tubular steel or chromium-plated steel support, and then there's a wooden shell, a molded wooden or plastic shell. And then the connection, even the connection between the two is articulated. It's a kind of a rubber pad that holds the two together. So this kind of articulation of structure, which is part of the modern movement, is very evident in all of the Eames furniture.
The idea was to take what happened in these chairs and sort of design a system where they could be produced economically and quickly and with less effort.
Because from the very beginning, even when Charles and Ray were working on the organic competition furniture, it was always thought of as mass production, how to have good quality without being a single one-by-one piece.
Then we came out to California really because we knew no one here. We wanted to work on some aspects of furniture. And
we were living in the village, in Westwood Village. And Charles working all day at the studio and, at MGM, art department, doing set designing, and he really enjoyed that. Oh, so ancient. Looking at, when I think about, we were in a Neutra apartment, living in a Neutra apartment in Westwood, and we used we had two rooms, one of the rooms we used as our workplace, and that's where we did all the first experiments on the plywood. We built the first tool that did the molding, which was so magic. The vacuum chamber, the molding box, we called it by a magic name. We still called it Kazam. Saturday night was the night to go shopping, And there was a great Sears store, and it was naturally during the war. Material was very, very scarce, and in order to do anything, we had nothing to start with. So we would go up to Sears and look at all the great pliers and wire cutters and clamps and finding, beautiful T-square finally, because they were just not available. Ancient history. There were a couple of sculptures. They were not just done as sculpture as such. It was really a way of testing. So much was learned from those. There were two major pieces. They were attempts to discover as much as we could about the nature of the wood and plywood, how far we could take compound curves, and how much it could be varied in thickness. So we would build up thickness. We experimented by, instead of having all layers equal, by introducing tapered layers of the same balanced construction. We could go from an edge that was very, very thin and then thicken it to be, to have a real mass at one point, so that one edge of the wood would be very thin and another would be quite thick, and how far it could curve.
Then the war came, and while we were interested in furniture, we turned our attention to molded plywood splints and litters, things for transporting injured men, using the same techniques. By that time we had this little facility going. And that was done while the war was winding down. We developed the pieces of furniture that were shown at the museum in '46.
They had really acquired the knowledge that they didn't have at the time of the competition. And they had, in fact, produced a line of furniture which was now ready to be shown in 1946. So I staged another show.
After the first Eames chair was developed, right after World War II, no furniture anywhere in the world was being produced that wasn't influenced by it.
Just gone through a war, and there was new technology, and you wanted, okay, what is the fruit of this technology? And so we set out in doing the plastic chair, the polyester resin with a fiberglass reinforcement. I think that the particular chair, I guess it was the first consumer use of such a material.
To design furniture, I think, which people could afford. This is a machine age of becoming an electronic one, and these are really products of the machine age. It's machine-made furniture and it's machine-designed furniture. It's not furniture that was designed to be made by hand, which is now being made by machines. Although there's a lot of handwork in some of Eames's chairs, the work is integrated with the machine from the early design stages. The design sort of grew out of machine technology.
But he also basically is an inventor. When he has a goal in mind and there's no machine that lives up to that production goal, he invents the machine. He invents the plastic mold to conform to the kind of chair he has in mind.
There's a thing that you sort of can't lose sight of, even aside from the technique of production, that is in the general concept and design, because you can do a piece of furniture, or as you can do almost any object, and you can look at it, and it can seem to be quite satisfying. But there are several questions we usually ask ourselves. And I know, first of all, we'd say, what would Mies van der Rohe say about it if he looked at it? You'd say then, what would Bucky Fuller say about it? He would say something. But then you'd ask yourself another question. That was, you can stand it now, but could you stand it if you saw 50 in a row? And this is a very brutal question, because very often you can do a thing which will stand up as one as a kind, but God help you if you do more than 5 or 6.
How about 20 in a pile?
Yeah.
20 in a pile.
Anyone making one thing, that's very nice to make one thing, but to be able to keep the quality in mass production, we could easily turn out a nice thing and another and another and another, but to figure a way that the hundredths and the 500ths and the thousandths would have the original character is the only reason we'd be working so hard.
I'm a real, genuine Middle Westerner. I was born in St. Louis. That's on the banks of the Mississippi. I was born on the anniversary of the Battle of Bunker's Hill, which had its sort of effect. One of the first things I remember is seeing Halley's Comet. Not that I could see it so well at the age 3, but it was sort of important enough because it stopped my mother and my father in the middle of a piano flute duet, and I knew it must be something awesome. My father was quite a bit older than I was, and I thought everybody else had booby young fathers. I had a respectable father, of a very respectable age. Life was sort of good in St. Louis. I worked the normal drugstore thing at 13, and believe me, this is where young boys learn about life. I worked in a steel mill in Illinois at age 14. It sounds now like something very dramatic and some plight that a young kid is. At the time, it was really, really fun. I enjoyed a lot of the mechanical things, and it was then while I was working in the steel mill that instead of going to engineering school, why I had, through other things, heard about what architecture could mean. So I went into architectural school.
Is it true that your leaving college had something to do with Frank Lloyd Wright?
Well, at the time I was kicked out of the university, which was the beginning of the second year. It wasn't all that clear, but when many years later they asked me to come back, why the old head of the school, and talking to the school and introducing me, said that I had been asked to leave the school because I was prematurely and over-enthusiastically concerned about Frank Lloyd Wright. By the way, I shouldn't bill myself as a genuine Frank Lloyd Wright buff, because while he was a tremendous influence in a way, but that impact was really more an impact of attitude than form, because in about 25, I guess it was, that the Wright biography came out, the autobiography, and all that marvelous schmaltz about Wisconsin and the fields and the weather and the earth and the material. That really got to me. It's really, really great stuff. To Stuttgart. at that point then heard a lot about the Bauhaus and Mies and Corbu and Gropius, all that building. And boy, this is like having a hose turned on you or something. It was a real shock, and I got interested and stayed there for a while. During that period, the very early 30s, Alvar Aalto brought a new kind of life to young architects because he was such an earthy guy, but at the same time terribly meticulous, and he really knew the relationships between nature, material, and the nature of people. When anybody starts to practice architecture the year after the Great Depression, why it certainly has some bearing on what happens, and we were naturally taking whatever commissions we could get, and we did end up doing some churches, Catholic churches in Arkansas, and in order to do it we were doing the sculpture, designing the murals, painting the murals, but everyone was doing that. I was invited to Cranbrook by Eliel Saarinen on a fellowship. You know, some schools like Wines have vintage years, and this you couldn't help but feel was a vintage year. The time was remarkable. There were many people. It was a marvelous time. Marvelous. And of course, that great last of the Renaissance sculptors, Carl Milles, was there, a great romantic. He used to cut my hair. Ray had been a painter working with Hans Hofmann, and then it was the end of the 30s when she came to Cranbrook really to be exposed to architecture, to be exposed to structure in a sense that Hans had taught her in painting. It was there that we met. Ray actually worked on the presentation drawings for the organic competition that Eero and I worked on. And Eero, of course, who was a real star, had lots of competition. But Eero, when we first met, why, I was the young, wise American guy, and Eero was the son of the great master, and so we were naturally immediately suspicious of each other, and that after a few nights of conviviality, why, we got over that. Eliel is a very great teacher. Eliel Saarinen is Eero's father, and Eliel was a great architect. He really drilled in the idea that it was impossible to think of any segment of a problem without involving both the next larger thing and the next smaller thing. Eero and I worked together in his father's office. We worked together in that sense, but we were always in touch. We felt very close all through the rest of our lives. If Eero had an idea that he's going to work on a piece of furniture, he'd like as not call me up in the middle of the night and tell me the idea, because in a sense he was staking a claim for that idea. And I would be sleepy, I'd say, don't tell me, I don't want to hear it, but he'd go on and expand it as though he was sort of laying out the patent application for future uses. But on other things, why, we worked on the Dulles Airport, for example. Then the IBM Pavilion we would have worked on, and Eero died, God damn it.
Toy trains were shot in the studio on the grounds of Ray and Charles' home. They had a lot of trains for years and years and years and years, which just seemed to keep appearing. And one day they became a film. It started by a call from Ray and Charles to come to see some material that they'd been working on. And in their study, on the grounds of their home, they had built probably not more than about a 4-foot table on which they'd taken many photographs of the toy trains. And Charles began to, in his, I think, very inimitable way, to spin out this story. It was a story of this train, you know, that went from point A to point B, and of various adventures encountered in the journey of this train and the people that were concerned with it. I think it was in that film that together we refined a way of working which, of course, composers dream of, to have a scenario for a film and then having the freedom to compose the music away from the film and having the film really edited back to the music.
We shot this film as a toccata, and Elmer composed a toccata for it, so that both visually and musically it has a toccata form. And yet we all together demanded one more thing out of it, and that would be if you would play the score in completely independent of the film, would it hold as a piece of music?
Now, of course, you may know that they have a light collection of boats, and I'm waiting for the boats to appear for about 15 years now. As any day we'll get to that.
Toys, real toys in the old sense, are probably less self-conscious than almost any other design product. I mean, this is why in the toccata for toy trains we felt very strongly about the way materials were used, because they were used in such a genuine, obvious, unself-conscious way. Toys are not for children. Toys are really for adults, especially grandparents. In the first 2 or 3 films, I had absolutely no experience in cutting, and there was a guy down at Consolidated who was in the 16 department, Ted Vogelman, and while cutting the first ones, I had neither synchronizer nor rewinds, and just scissors, splicers, and glue, and Ted Vogelman on the telephone. For the opening, that I thought more or less you have to have a place where you can recognize where you're going when you start out.
You did once talk about the football.
Yeah, it could be next to Soldiers Field. You recognize the Great Lakes.
How did you start making film?
Well, very, very simple, like everything else. His friend Philip and Amanda Dunn went to South America to shoot the Gaucho and left us with a Sound 16 projector, and we didn't have anything to show of it, so we shot the first picture just to see how the device worked.
we were making a film which was in itself just an experiment. I mean, just to see what happens when you put motion or ideas on film.
We had the toys, and they were at a scale that could be attacked little by little. So we could pick it up and do a little bit and put these little bits together. Then we did the blacktop.
That was in 1950. Why, that was right here in a schoolyard, and we were interested in laying one kind of variation over another kind of variation and see what the relationships the two would give. And so that was the patterns of water over a schoolyard played on top of the Ladasca's Goldberg variation.
Remarkable things happened to us when the music so beautifully coincided in so many places. That was absolutely thrilling. But then after that, we felt really had to have some discipline and be in control. So that's when we made Parade.
I think there's an intimate relationship between toys and science. It lies in the domain which all architects are familiar with, the domain of model making. People like to see unity, and I think there is a deep unity in the world, and I think probably the work of Charles Eames has an enormous unity of its own, and I've tried to talk about it. Model making, the design of theories, is the same thing as the operation of toys. In fact, toys are models, and to make a toy work, you must know something about the real thing or it won't work. Now, the other side of it is, and I think this goes back to in a way, to the 19th century developers of the early mechanical computers, which look sort of toy-like. They were, after all, they're simulations of how people think and to some extent, how people move and act. And a toy is like that. The jointed mechanical doll. It's a simulation device, and the computer is a simulation device, of course, is one of its main attributes today. I think the interest that Charles has shown in the computer, which long antedates the computer as a big industry. Then he was interested in it because of the theoretical structure, because you could take apart everything that had meaning and form and show it could be made as a simple combination of yes, no, binary choices. That's what the communications primer is all about. It's one of the great ideas of communication theory. And the computer arises from that.
The message being transmitted here may be unlimited in the range and the subtlety of its ideas. Yet the method and the signal are such that they must be fed to the transmitter in a series of positive decisions. The system calls for the key to be either up or down. The code calls for a dot or a dash. The current flows. It ceases to flow. It flows. It is black or white. It is stop or go, on or off, one or none, go or no go, or black or white, as in this small area from a halftone reproduction in a magazine. The press that printed it is capable of printing but one color of ink at a time, in this case black ink on white paper. In order to transmit the image, it had to be broken down to many points of decision, black or white. We know that such a limitation is not at all restricting if enough decisions are made. In this case, 500,000 decided points give fair rendition. 1,000,000 would be better. Conventional printing of color is no different except that with the added factor of color, 4 times the number of decisions had to be made. One set in yellow, one in red, in blue, and in black. Whenever added factors in a problem are recognized, the number of decisions necessary for the solution grows by large leaps. As theories and equipment and men develop, it becomes apparent that one sure way of handling multiple factors is to build a system that can handle each decision in its time. Men have long known the theory on which complex problems of many factors can be solved, but the number of decisions, the calculations necessary were prodigious, and not until the recent development of the electronic calculator could these areas be touched.
The first film we made on communications is because we wanted to introduce architects, for example, to the idea that there was other ways of organizing material except doing it on a scratch pad and with a triangle and T-square. So we made the film to introduce architects to the idea of information theory and how information of all sorts could be handled efficiently and effectively.
We felt very strongly that these were techniques that wouldn't in any way diminish the ingenuity, genius, insights, anything that a talented and a well-trained architect would have, but what it would do, because of the hardcore information, the information that it would help provide and the insights, it would just put him on a higher platform from which to operate, and it would sort of raise the whole level of the problem. As it turned out, the architects more or less couldn't care less, and the Department of Labor, I think, bought 50 prints in one, so you can see where the sympathy lay.
I think that Charles' main interest in life is the projection of concepts and the development of ideas. And I think that Charles uses film as an extension of the process of projection of his concepts and ideas.
We've never used film as an art form. Our commitment has always been to either the process, I'm talking about a process you're investigating, like whether it's the computer or whether it's having other things to do with natural law, or the object. The first commitment is to that, and we just use film as a tool.
Whatever is possible, we use if it makes it clearer.
This is an old story, but it reminds us of the surprises we can get when even a small number like 2 is multiplied by itself many times. King Shahram of India was so pleased when his Grand Vizier Sissa Bendar presented him with the game of chess that he asked Bendar to name his own reward. The request was so modest that the happy king immediately complied. What the Grand Vizier had asked was this: that 1 grain of wheat be placed on the first square of the chessboard, 2 grains on the second square, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, 16 on the fifth square, and so on, doubling the amount of wheat on each succeeding square until all 64 squares were accounted for. When the king's steward had gotten to the 17th square, the table was well filled. By the 26th square, the chamber held considerable wheat, and a nervous king ordered the steward to speed up the count. When 42 squares were accounted for, the palace itself was swamped. Now fit to be tied, King Shahram learns from the court mathematician that had the process continued, the wheat required would have covered all India to a depth of over 50 feet. Incidentally, laying this many grains of wheat end to end also does something rather spectacular. They would stretch from the Earth, beyond the Sun, past the orbits of the planets, far out across the galaxy to the star Alpha Centauri, 4 light years away. They would then stretch back to Earth, back to Alpha Centauri, and back to the Earth again.
in our machine here is a soapy solution. And we have different shapes. And there are occasions when people need to know what the smallest area possible for a given shape can be. Do you want to push that button, please? Now watch the triangle. Can you see what happened? The soap bubble is connected in the middle. Now see, the other one is showing the smallest surface area that can be done on that particular shape. And back here, there's a cube, and it does the same thing, and you'll see a demonstration of what we talked about there.
Mathematica it's been in place in the museum here in Los Angeles for about 10, 12 years. The show is old, but the audience is new. And when Ray and I, a few weeks ago, ran into a graduate from Caltech who had mastered in
geometry,
pretty highly disciplined mathematics, and we found that he was first introduced to mathematics at Mathematica. It made us feel both old and good. Good and old.
also hold your hand. Now when you come down to the eyepiece at the end and look at the same display, it looks very, very different. This is true of all the things here. And this really means that what you see depends upon your point of view.
Yay. My head. I feel like I'm head's in two parts. I feel like I'm bouncing. It's like I ate a hot dog that's too long for me. I'm bouncing myself.
Almost everything Charles does works at several levels. This fun mirror is a good example. Children have as much fun with it as we do, and yet you can come in here with a mathematician and show exactly why that fun mirror belongs here and why it is connected with some central concept. He had that thing sitting around in his lab for a while and finally asked whether it had anything to do with mathematics, and of course it does. It homes right in on topology and distortion that preserves some of the structure and so on. 1 point on you, the tip of your shoe, goes into 2 points in the image. And this brings you into the idea of mappings that are not one-to-one and all kinds of goodies that are very important in modern mathematics.
During the development of it, Mathematica, where we had this history wall that is a graphic chart of the lives of mathematicians since the 10th century, why, it was Ray Redheffer that wrote the biographies of the mathematicians.
You watch the arrow carefully and see if you see it cross an edge.
He did the same thing with this Möbius band over here. That was sitting around a long time.
Why was it sitting around?
He had it sitting around because he has a very unusual insight. He knows the right thing to have sitting around.
Now this is like a mechanical rendition of the solar system. And those balls represent some of the planets.
Here at Mathematica, many of the things you see really have nothing to do with numbers.
That one's going to go in. I think it's going to take a long time. This is neat.
They have to do with concepts, they have to do with modeling, and they have to do with methods and processes that don't essentially involve numbers.
Now our multiplication cube lights up a lot of numbers. Geometry that is 5 feet on the side will light up the whole thing, and you can see how many lights we have.
After Mathematica, we realized that there were sort of a lot of things that weren't quite said, and one of them was sort of the some insight as to what the tremendous range from the very small to the very large was, because we felt that people today, as never before, they're faced with using these things even though they can't sense them. And about that time, a great teacher in Holland, Kees Burke, had written a book called, published a book called The Cosmic View, which was a very great and insightful sort of thing. What we were trying to do was to make clear, give a sort of a down-to-earth gut feeling of what it meant for things to increase in an exponential rate.
We begin with a scene 1 meter wide, which we view from just 1 meter away. The sleeping man is having a picnic on a Miami golf course. As we back off, the clocks start, and we accelerate in such a way that after 10 seconds have elapsed, we will be exactly 10 times farther away. Now the scene is 10 meters wide, and in 10 seconds it will be 10 times that wide. The sleeping man is still in the center and will remain there long after he is lost to sight. After the second 10 seconds, the square we see is 100 meters wide, the distance a man can run in 10 seconds. Now a kilometer, 1,000 meters, the distance a racing car can drive in 10 seconds. The picnic is about lost as we begin to see Miami Beach. 10 to the 4th power, 10,000 meters, the distance a supersonic aeroplane can travel in 10 seconds. 10 to the 5th power, a 1 and 5 zeros, the distance a satellite in orbit can cover in 10 seconds. Our speed is growing at a tremendous rate. In these past 10 seconds, we will have covered almost 1 million meters. The Earth, that will be all but gone in about 20 seconds, looks solid and imposing and remarkably spherical. 10 to the 7th. Our speed is now about 2 million miles an hour, 0.3% of the speed of light, and growing fast. A beam of light on the same plane as Earth would travel this far in 1 second. We can now see the orbital path of the moon around the Earth. As our speed gets to be a substantial percentage of the speed of light, it has an effect on our time scale. What seems a normal 10 seconds to us would be a much longer period in relative Earth time. Our clocks are getting out of synchronization. Now a long time elapses on Earth for each 10 seconds of our traveling time. The clock is spinning round. The light from the sun appears, and parts of the orbit paths of some of the planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. 10 to the 12th. Considerably farther away is the outer group of planets, so that we now see our whole solar system.
That film is so beautifully visualized, and in addition, it has this strong but not, not imposing theoretical framework with the dashboard on the left of the screen, so you can orient yourself, say how fast you're going. That's a remarkable idea, you see, that it puts you into the position of a rider in some marvelous spaceship that can't be invented.
The trip back to the picnic on the golf course will be a sped-up reverse version, reducing the distance to the Earth's surface by 1 magnitude every 2 seconds. Every 2 seconds, we will appear to cover 90% of the distance back to Earth. We notice the rhythm of change between periods of great activity and relative inactivity that will continue all the way down to our next target, the nucleus of a carbon atom just beneath the skin on the hand of the sleeping man at the picnic. Enter the 9th meters. Enter the 8th, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are back at our starting point.
No side tours, no looks back, nothing of that sort. Just the pure exponentiation. Times 10, times 10, times 10, times 10, inevitably carrying you from your own hand to the depths of the universe. I think it has a wonderful sweep to it.
Philip Morrison, at that time, was in the Commission of College Physics. He gave us advice and counsel on some of the interpretations of the first stab at powers of 10, And there were a lot of subtle points and a lot of beautiful points that he contributed.
Of course, I knew and admired Charles Eames before I really acquired a serious interest in innovation in science education, which is one of the things I've been trying to do for some years. But when I finally realized that we were doing such a bad job of education in science, and the public did not understand science, and our students didn't really understand science except those that somehow or other got across some barrier, and then it was fine, I recognized that the kind of path to take people across that barrier was maybe being provided by Charles Eames, who produced science, good science, as I've tried to argue, carefully thought through and analyzed, but in a form so beautiful, so elegant, so compelling because of the way it looks at the thing, that many more people could perhaps be brought to look at it that way. And I think that's the main thing that I've learned, that we must have a much freer and a much, to use the word, a much more artistic view of how we teach people science and how we write the books and produce the films and make the apparatus. Think about how it looks. Think about whether it's beautiful or not.
There seems to be a general assumption that science and art form a kind of a discontinuity, and I don't think anything could be farther from the truth. When a poet, for example, views two entirely different things, seemingly have no relationship, but builds a beautiful simile out of it, it's exactly the same as when a scientist, Newton, for example, when he saw the moon and he saw the apple fall, two seemingly unrelated things in which he built one of the most exquisite theories, principles of all time. I mean, if you were to write a job description for the best scientist in the world, why it would run something like this. It would be someone who could look at a state of relationships that were seemingly chaotic, and by studying them long enough, come upon functional relationship between the parts, and as a result of study of that, build a structure, and from that structure arrive at a premise which he then puts into action. Now this kind of a description of talent would be the exact description that you would write for an artist, for a politician, for a newspaper editor, for a filmmaker, or anything. The continuity is absolutely complete.
He gave me a print of one of his most beautiful films, very simple film called Tops. And I have an astronomical theory which involves spinning objects on a gigantic scale, galaxies. And every time that I give some scientific talk to two professional astronomers and physicists about the nature of the theory, I show this film as sort of a dessert at the end, saying, look, tops are all the same, big and little. They all behave in a certain way, and here's a film that makes it very clear. Though all these people know about tops, the fact to see it realized in all those many forms gives a kind of richness to the idea, which I think adds a good deal to the equations and the detailed argument that we've presented. this quality of, if I can use the word, of a kind of love for the world, the way the world is. And that same concern for what the world is made out of, I think, motivates in some deep way that they don't really want to describe or think about in their daily work most people who went into science.
Two, three, cut. I suppose real honest to God cameramen feel that if you're once a still photographer, you're always a still photographer, and you're just doing it in motion pictures. I don't quite believe that, but there's probably, that's true to some extent. Well, I've shot almost all of it, because you're not going to let somebody else have all the fun. I started shooting stills when I was very young. My father, he had done a lot with cameras while they were still fairly new, and so he had a lot of material. And when he died, I was about 10, 11 years old, and he left a whole cache of material which I found. I was sort of an avid instructions reader, and started using the stuff. And well, I had been taking pictures of my friends for a greater part of a year before I discovered that Eastman had invented film. I'd been doing it all on wet plate. See, we use photography just like you'd use any tool. It's something that applies to almost anything that we do. It becomes an extension of it. If you're talking about one subject, naturally you can get a lot more information in a series of shortcut stills than you could in one pan shot. But there are other things I think that a still can do. They still can get a kind of mood where you sort of capture the thing and you immerse yourself in it. And even the forms have a different effect on you emotionally than a piece of motion picture where you're anticipating subtle changes within the picture. That doesn't mean to say that one's better than the other. It's just a difference. Survived that one again.
Yes, at least the columns came on together.
You seem to particularly enjoy doing multi-screen projection films. Why?
Yeah, what it really ends up being is a great invention. It's an invention that sort of allows you to show more slides to an audience in 5 minutes than they've ever experienced before. It's an outlet for a picture-taking maniac.
Had you done any multi-screen films before the Moscow Fair?
Oh, certainly. There were our own experiments, but I suppose one of the first real ones was the sample lesson.
Rough sketch of a sample lesson for a hypothetical course.
It's interesting, and thinking about it also, that it was a form of report originally,
George Nelson and Alexander Gerard and Ray and myself had been asked by the Rockefeller Foundation to make a study of this problem. That is, deliver as much information to a class as we could in 1 hour. Because we also found that the amount of information people could take in, particularly image-wise, was much greater than they were usually offered. Not only was there multiple screen material, but there was a highly controlled amount of sound, and also a program of smells that were synchronized with the images. And we had something like 6 smells, and Sandro Gerard masterminded the smells. He's somewhat of a smell authority. The Moscow thing had to make sense in delivering of a message to one urban community to another urban community that had their fill of talk and words ceased to mean something. But pictures still meant something. And to make that work, where we had to pull together a lot of pictures at a time.
In summer of 1959, there was this first very large U.S. exhibit in Moscow, in Sokolniki Park in Moscow. That was the exhibition that Nixon opened and where he had that kitchen debate with Khrushchev. The U.S. Information Agency had decided, for some reason which wasn't clear to anyone, to build a huge Buckminster Fuller dome at the entrance to the exhibition. And having built this dome, they then had to decide what to put into it. And someone came up with this brilliant idea of turning the whole problem over to Charles and Ray. Well, Charles and Ray said that they would be producing a movie, which I think was to be 13 minutes long, which would describe a typical day or a typical work day and a typical Sunday in the life of American families. They specified that there should be 7 screens, very large screens, suspended inside the dome, and there would have to be 7 projectors, each set up very precisely on a different angle on a kind of concrete ramp. The dome was finished, and the projectors were in place, and everything was ready, but there was no film, and it was about a day or 2 before the opening. And all of us were having a sort of collective nervous breakdown because this was going to be a total disaster if there was nothing to show inside this huge dome. When all of a sudden, I think it was the night before the opening, practically, we were standing in that dome, and all of a sudden, out of the dark in Sokolniki Park in Moscow, came Charles and Ray, dressed like a Boy Scout and a Girl Scout, and carrying a sort of canvas bag with all the cans of film in their bags. We put them into the projector, and it was absolutely perfect. There was not a single hitch. It was absolutely flawless. And I don't really know much about how to make films and so on, but it seems to me that making a totally new kind of presentation, 7 screens, 7 different reels, completely coordinated, often interchanging